Nebraska Territory, November 12, 1856. The storm buried 3 feet of snow in 18 hours. Temperatures dropped to 25 degrees below zero. Wind drove ice crystals through gaps in fresh chinked walls. Inside hastily built cabins, settlers woke to frost on their rafters and water buckets frozen solid 3 feet from the fire. Most had built fast, standard practice for men racing against the first snow. Single-wall construction, 6-inch logs, notches cut by eye, adjusted by trial. Good enough for mild seasons. Fatal when weather turned. In one valley, a different approach was being tested. A homesteader had spent the previous month building reusable angle blocks, simple wooden jigs that set every notch to identical depth and angle. The method promised speed without sacrifice, logs that dropped into place without shimming, without gaps, without the endless recutting that wasted daylight and patience. The math was brutal. 4 cords of firewood per month, or 2. Survival or spring departure. Winter would decide which method had been right. The wind came from the northwest, steady and cold. Inside the cabin, a single candle burned on the rough plank table. The homesteader, a carpenter by training, a settler by necessity, set down his pencil and studied the numbers in his ledger. Firewood burned, 1 3/4 cords, November 1st through 30th. Standard cabin, same valley, same month, 4 cords. The difference wasn't luck, it was gaps, or rather, the absence of them. He had arrived in the valley in late summer with tools most homesteaders didn't carry: a bevel gauge, a marking knife, a set of dividers. He'd worked 3 seasons in a Wisconsin sawmill before filing his claim. He understood that wood moved, that unseasoned logs shrank, that hand-cut notches varied by fatigue and haste. He'd seen cabins fail not from bad timber, but from bad joinery. The standard method was simple: scribe a notch by laying one log across another. Cut it out with an axe and adze. Check the fit. Cut more if needed. Repeat 40 times for a small cabin. The process worked, but it compounded error. An 1/8-inch variation in the first notch became a 1/2-inch gap by the 10th course. Chinking filled the void, but chinking cracked. Cold air followed the cracks. He'd spent 2 weeks in September building what he called angle blocks. They were simple tools, wooden frames that clamped onto a log and guided the saw and chisel to cut notches at fixed angles and depths. 1 block for dovetail joints, another for saddle notches. Each block was adjustable for log diameter but held the cutting geometry constant. The first time he'd used them, the crew, 2 neighbors helping in exchange for the same assistance on their own builds, had been skeptical. The blocks added setup time. You had to measure the log, set the block, clamp it secure. But once set, the cutting was fast, and the second log went faster still, because the block was already calibrated. By the 20th log, they were working at double the speed of traditional scribing. More importantly, the logs fit. The first time without shimming. No gaps to pack with moss and clay. No recutting because the notch was too shallow or the angle wrong. The walls went up straight and tight. The cabin measured 16 feet by 20, larger than most first-year homesteads, but not extravagant. The walls were 7 feet tall, built from logs 12 inches in diameter, hewn flat on the interior face. The roof was pole and sod, double-layered. A stone fireplace stood in the southeast corner, positioned to radiate heat toward the living space while keeping its mass inside the insulated envelope. Total construction time, 42 days, including the 2 weeks spent building the jigs. A standard cabin, 10 by 12 feet, took experienced builders 8 to 10 days. The question was whether the extra time bought anything beyond precision. November's cold provided the first answer. The cabin stayed warm with half the firewood. The tight joints eliminated drafts. Heat from the fireplace circulated instead of escaping through gaps in the chinking. Morning frost formed outside the walls, not inside. December would bring the real test. Weather reports from Fort Laramie, 60 miles southeast, indicated an unusually severe season forming. Storms were already stacking across the northern plains. Temperatures in some areas had dropped below 30 below zero before Christmas. Settlements were burning through their firewood stockpiles at rates that threatened supply before spring. The homesteader added another line to his ledger: firewood on hand, 18 cords. At current rate, sufficient through April. He closed the book and banked the fire for the night. Outside, the wind continued its low howl. Inside, the cabin held its warmth. The angle block sat on a shelf near the door, ready for the next builder who asked how the cabin stayed so warm. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero on December 4th. It stayed there for 6 days. In cabins throughout the valley, settlers burned wood faster than they'd planned. The standard practice, 4 cords per month, had been calculated for normal winters. This wasn't normal. Some families were burning 6 cords. The mathematics of survival shifted daily. Wood that should have lasted until March would be gone by February. Men went out in the dark cold to cut more. Axes rang against frozen cottonwood. Saws bound in green timber. Fingers went numb inside mittens. The work was dangerous when you were warm and rested. In sub-zero cold, exhausted from short rations and shorter sleep, it became a lottery. A man from the next valley over lost 3 fingers to frostbite after his axe glanced, and he couldn't feel the blood until he was back inside. He survived, but he wouldn't swing an axe the same way again. The homesteader with the angle blocks burned 2 cords in December. Less than half the valley average. Less than a third of what the struggling cabins consumed. Word spread. The first visitor arrived on December 9th, a settler named William Crawford, whose claim sat 2 miles north. Crawford was 43, a former Missouri farmer who'd filed for a homestead after crop failures pushed him west. His cabin was standard construction, 10 by 12 feet, single wall, notches cut by eye. He'd built it in 9 days with help from 2 other men. It was adequate for a mild winter. It wasn't adequate now. Crawford knocked, was invited in, and stood for a moment just inside the door, feeling the temperature difference. The homesteader's cabin was genuinely warm, not just less cold, but warm enough that a man could work without a coat. The walls showed no interior frost. The chinking showed no light gaps. "How?" Crawford asked. The homesteader showed him the angle blocks. Crawford picked one up, turned it over, examined the simple geometry. A wooden frame with adjustable stops, a clamping mechanism to hold it firm against the log, guide slots for saw and chisel. Nothing complicated, nothing that required special materials or skills beyond basic carpentry. "You built these?" "In September. Took 2 weeks." "And they work for every log?" "You adjust for diameter, but the angle stays the same. The depth stays the same. Every notch matches." Crawford set the block down. "Can you make more?" "I can, or you can. It's pine and oak, mortise joints, some leather for the clamp straps. Nothing difficult." "How long to build a set?" 3 days if you work steady. You need 1 block for dovetails, 1 for saddle notches, maybe a third for half lap joints if you're doing complex corners. Crawford did the math silently. 3 days of work in September would have meant tighter walls in December. Tighter walls would have meant less firewood. Less firewood would have meant less time in the killing cold, cutting more. The calculation was obvious. "I'll take you up on that," Crawford said. "Come spring, I'm rebuilding, and I'll pay you to show me how to make those blocks." The homesteader nodded. "No payment necessary. The method works better when more people use it. Means fewer men freezing for want of tight walls." Crawford left with measurements sketched on a piece of bark. By mid-December, 3 more settlers had visited. By January, the method was spreading. The storm hit on December 28th. 3 feet of snow in 36 hours. Wind gusts to 40 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Temperature fell to 32 below zero. Settlers who'd been cutting firewood found themselves trapped in their cabins. The snow came so fast that paths disappeared between axe stroke and carry. Men abandoned their tools in the drifts and fought their way back to shelter. Some didn't make it. The valley would find 2 bodies when the snow melted in April, one 50 yards from his cabin door, one 70. Inside the cabins, the real test began. A well-built cabin with tight walls and adequate firewood could maintain livable temperature even in extreme cold. The key word was adequate. Most settlers had burned through their safety margin by Christmas. Now they were burning their reserves. Some were burning furniture. One family burned their wagon bed. The homesteader with the angle blocks weathered the storm, burning 3/4 of a cord over 4 days. His cabin temperature stayed above 45 degrees. Not comfortable by Eastern standards, but survivable. Warm enough to sleep without fear of freezing. Warm enough to melt snow for water. Warm enough to cook. 2 miles away, Crawford's cabin was burning 2 cords over the same period and barely maintaining freezing temperature inside. The gaps in his walls, invisible in mild weather, became conduits for cold air. Every notch that was an 1/8 inch shallow, every joint that didn't seat flush, every crack in the chinking, all of them combined into a structure that leaked heat as fast as the fire could produce it. Crawford's family survived, but they burned through firewood he'd planned to last through February. When the storm cleared on December 31st, he had 4 cords remaining. At current burn rate, that meant 6 weeks. Spring thaw typically arrived in late March. The math didn't close. On January 3, 1857, Crawford made a decision. He loaded his family onto a sled and headed east. He wasn't alone. 7 families left the valley that week, not because they wanted to abandon their claims, but because their cabins couldn't keep them alive until spring. The homestead system required 5 years of continuous residence to prove up a claim. Leaving in winter meant starting the clock over. It meant losing a year's investment of labor and hope. But it beat freezing to death in a cabin that hadn't been built right. The survivors, those whose cabins were tight enough, whose firewood had lasted, whose planning or luck held, watched the departures in silence. There was no shame in leaving. There was only the recognition that frontier life sorted people by their preparations. The homesteader with the angle blocks watched Crawford's sled disappear into the snow. He'd offered to share his firewood. Crawford had refused. Pride or calculation, his 4 remaining cords wouldn't have been enough for 2 families anyway. That night, the homesteader added another entry to his ledger. 7 families departed. Cause: inadequate cabin construction leading to excessive fuel consumption. Solution known, but adopted too late. He closed the book. Outside, the temperature held at 20 below. Inside, the fire burned low, but sufficient. The walls, cut with precision 4 months earlier, performed exactly as geometry predicted they would. Word reached Fort Laramie by mid-January. 7 homesteads abandoned in Wind River Valley. Usual attrition for a hard winter, but the fort's quartermaster made note of something unusual. Several families reported that one settler's cabin had weathered the cold using half the expected firewood. The quartermaster was a practical man. His job was logistics. Fuel consumption rates mattered because the fort supplied emergency provisions to failing homesteads when available. Anything that reduced fuel needs meant fewer desperate families arriving at the fort's gates in March, starving and broke. He sent a courier to investigate. The courier arrived on January 18th. He was a civilian contractor named Thomas Mills, age 39, who'd worked freight routes for 6 years. He knew construction. He'd built his own cabin near the fort, and he understood what normal fuel consumption looked like. The homesteader showed Mills the angle blocks. Mills examined them with the attention of someone who'd cut thousands of logs and knew exactly how much time and wood got wasted on bad notches. "These are simple," Mills said. "That's the point. Complex tools don't work on the frontier. You need something you can build with common materials and maintain with basic skills. Mills picked up the dovetail block. What's the angle? 14 degrees. It's steep enough for strength, but shallow enough that the log doesn't split when you drive it home. And this holds consistent across different log diameters? You adjust the depth stops. The angle stays fixed. Mills set down the block and walked around the cabin's interior, examining the walls. The notches were identical, every joint seated flush. There were no shims, no wedges, no packed moss filling quarter-inch gaps. The construction quality was what you'd expect from a professional joiner, not a frontier homesteader working alone. How long to cut one notch using the blocks? 15 minutes if the log is straight, 20 if it's not. How long without the blocks? 25 to 30 minutes depending on skill, more if you have to recut. Mills did the arithmetic, 40 notches per cabin. Standard method, 16 to 20 hours of notching, plus recuts. Block method, 10 to 12 hours, no recuts. Time saved, 6 to 8 hours. But the real savings wasn't time. It was performance. Your fuel consumption? Mills asked. 2 cords in December, 3/4 cord during the big storm. Expected consumption for this size cabin? 4 to 5 cords per month in cold weather. Mills wrote the numbers in his notebook. He worked for the fort, but he also worked for himself. Information like this had value. Settlers who could reduce their firewood needs by half would pay attention. Merchants who supplied those settlers would pay more. Would you be willing to demonstrate this method at the fort? Mills asked. For what purpose? The quartermaster wants to reduce emergency provisioning. If homesteaders build better cabins, fewer families show up starving in March. Plus, there's commercial interest. I know 3 builders who'd pay to learn this. The homesteader considered. He had no interest in profit from the technique, but he had significant interest in fewer people dying from preventable construction failures. I'll demonstrate, he said. No charge, but anyone who learns has to agree to teach others who ask. The method works better when it spreads. Mills agreed. They set a date for early March, after the worst cold had passed, but before spring building season began. The demonstration would draw 43 people. 12 would adopt the method immediately. By 1860, variations of the angle block technique would appear in homestead cabins from Montana to Kansas. But that was future. In January 1857, it was simply one man's solution to the problem of staying warm without burning through his winter's labor supply. The cold continued. Temperatures stayed below zero for 18 consecutive days in February. This was the pattern settlers feared most. Not a single catastrophic storm, but sustained cold that slowly burned through reserves. Every day required firewood. Every day drew down the stockpile. The math was relentless. Cabins that had seemed adequate in November showed their weaknesses by February. Chinking that had merely cracked in December was now falling out in chunks. Logs that had been green when stacked had shrunk, opening gaps. Corner joints that had been tight were now loose enough to admit wind. Each flaw compounded. Each gap meant more heat loss. More heat loss meant more firewood burned. More firewood burned meant less time before the pile ran out. The homesteader's cabin showed none of these failures. The logs had been cut in August, stripped immediately, and allowed to season through September. By October, when construction began, the wood had already completed most of its shrinkage. The notches, cut to precise dimensions with the angle blocks, held firm even as the logs finished settling. There were no gaps to widen. There was no chinking to crack because there had been minimal chinking needed. On February 8th, a second visitor arrived. She was a Shoshone woman whose band wintered 12 miles west. She came alone, walking on snowshoes, carrying a pack with dried meat to trade for flour. The homesteader invited her in. They negotiated the trade in a mixture of Shoshone, English, and hand signs. When the exchange was complete, she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she walked around the cabin's interior, examining the walls with clear professional interest. "Good build," she said in English. "White man usually builds fast, not tight." The homesteader nodded. "This one took longer." She pointed at a corner joint. "How you cut this? All same." He showed her the angle block. She picked it up, turned it over, understanding immediately. Her people didn't build with logs. They used poles and hides for seasonal shelters, earth and stone for permanent structures. But the principle of consistent joinery was universal. A pole that didn't seat properly in its socket meant a shelter that leaked or collapsed. The angle block solved the same problem for a different construction method. "Smart tool," she said. "Take long to make?" 3 days. "Save time later?" "Saves time and wood. Better walls mean less fire needed." She nodded. "My people know this. 2 skins better than 1 skin. Air between skins makes warm." This was information the homesteader hadn't considered. Double wall construction with an air gap for insulation. He'd heard of it, but hadn't attempted it himself. His cabin was single wall, relying on tight joinery and thick logs for thermal performance. "How much better?" he asked. She held up 2 fingers. "Half fire." The homesteader did the calculation. His cabin already used half the wood of standard construction because of tight joints. Double wall with air gap could theoretically cut that in half again. 1 cord per month instead of 2. 18 cords per winter instead of 36. The savings weren't just fuel. They were time, labor, and risk. Every hour not spent cutting wood was an hour spent on other survival tasks: hunting, maintaining equipment, resting. Every cord not burned was 1 less trip into the cold with an axe and saw. "Show me," he said. She sketched the concept using charcoal on a plank. 2 walls, one inside the other. Gap between them filled with bark, moss, or dried grass. The inner wall carried the structural load. The outer wall protected against weather and provided the insulation gap. The homesteader studied the drawing. The construction would require more logs and more time. But if it truly halved fuel consumption again, the investment would pay back in a single winter. "Next cabin I build," he said, "I'll use this." She smiled slightly. White man learning. They parted with mutual respect. She headed west into the snow. He returned to his fire, adding 1 more note to his ledger. Double wall construction. Investigate further. Possible fuel reduction, additional 50%. The angle blocks had solved the problem of precise joinery. But there were other problems still to solve. The frontier demanded constant learning. The homesteader's fuel consumption for February totaled 1 7/8 cords. The calculation was precise because he'd kept daily records since November. Each morning he measured the woodpile. Each evening he estimated the day's burn. The numbers revealed patterns. Coldest days, 1/16 cord burned. Moderate days, 1/20 cord. Mild days, anything above 10 degrees. 1/25 cord. February had delivered 16 cold days, 9 moderate days, 3 mild days. Total consumption tracked within 5% of his predictions. This was the power of tight construction. Performance became predictable. With predictable performance came plannable survival. By contrast, reports from other valleys indicated fuel consumption that varied wildly. Some cabins burned 4 cords in February. Some burned 6. The variation correlated directly with construction quality. Cabins built fast and loose burned more. Cabins built slow and tight burned less. The difference wasn't small. It was the margin between making it to spring and abandoning your claim. On February 24th, temperatures rose above freezing for the first time in 37 days. Snow began to melt. Settlers emerged from their cabins to assess damage and count remaining supplies. The results were sobering. Of the 23 homesteads that had started the winter in Wind River Valley, 16 remained occupied. 7 had been abandoned. Of the 16 remaining, 4 were burning furniture. 3 were down to less than 2 cords of firewood, with 4 to 6 weeks of winter remaining. 2 families had resorted to burning hay twisted into tight bundles, a desperate measure that produced minimal heat and destroyed feedstock needed for livestock. The homesteader still had 14 1/8 cords remaining. At current consumption rates, this was sufficient through mid-April. Spring thaw typically arrived in late March. He would finish the winter with surplus. This surplus represented more than comfort. It represented options. A man with extra firewood could help a neighbor, could trade for supplies, could spend time on productive work instead of desperate woodcutting, could approach spring healthy instead of exhausted. On February 26th, one of the struggling families, a man, his wife, and 2 children, appeared at the homesteader's door. They hadn't come to ask for firewood, though they clearly needed it. They'd come to ask about the angle blocks. The man's name was Robert Hayes. He was 31, originally from Illinois, a former store clerk with minimal building experience. His cabin had been constructed with help from other settlers who'd used standard methods. The notches were loose. The walls showed gaps. The fuel consumption was catastrophic. "I won't make it to spring," Hayes said simply. "I've got 1 cord left, maybe 2 weeks of burn. My wife is sick. The children are showing signs of cold injury. We leave now, we might make Fort Laramie. We stay, we die." The homesteader considered the situation. Sharing his firewood would deplete his surplus, but still leave enough for his own needs. But that wasn't a solution. Even with donated fuel, Hayes's cabin would continue burning at unsustainable rates. The structure itself was the problem. "How much time do you need?" the homesteader asked. "For what?" "To rebuild your corners. If we tighten your notches and re-chink properly, your fuel consumption drops. Maybe not to my rate, but enough to make your remaining wood last." Hayes stared. "Rebuild? In February? The worst cold is past. Today's above freezing. We've got maybe 3 more weeks of burn weather, then it's just cold nights. If we spend 3 days fixing your cabin, you save 1/16 cord per day. That's 1.5 cords over the remaining winter. More than enough to justify the work." Hayes did the math. 3 days of labor in exchange for survival. The equation wasn't complicated. "I'll pay you. No payment. You help me rebuild your corners. You learn the method. Next year, you teach someone else who needs it." They started work on February 27th. The homesteader brought his angle blocks. They recut the worst notches, packed the gaps with clay and moss mixed with pine resin, and stabilized the corner joints with wooden pins. The work was cold and difficult, but the results were immediate. Hayes's cabin temperature rose by 8 to 10 degrees. Fuel consumption dropped by 1/3. Hayes's family survived the winter. They remained on their claim. By spring, Hayes had built his own set of angle blocks. The method continued to spread, 1 cabin at a time, driven not by profit, but by the simple calculation of survival. 43 people gathered at the fort on March 12th. Settlers, builders, Army carpenters, merchants who supplied construction materials. Thomas Mills had spread word of the demonstration. The attendance exceeded expectations. The homesteader arrived with his angle blocks and the demonstration log. The log showed the contrast clearly, one end with machine-like precision, one end with the typical variation of hand-cut notches. The difference was visible from 10 feet away. He began with explanation, not demonstration. The crowd needed to understand why precision mattered before they'd invest time in achieving it. Standard cabin, 10 by 12 feet, burns 4 cords per month in cold weather, he said. That's 48 cords if winter runs from November through March. At 3 hours per cord to cut and split, that's 144 hours of fuel labor. Plus the risk, you're working in cold with sharp tools when you're tired. He paused, letting them calculate. Tight cabin, same size, burns 2 cords per month, 24 cords per winter, 72 hours of fuel labor. You save 72 hours and 24 cords. That 24 cords represents 8 days of cutting if you work 3 hours per day. 8 days you're not in the cold. 8 days your hands stay warm. 8 days you're not risking frostbite or an axe accident. The math resonated. Every man present understood the exhaustion of winter woodcutting. The idea of cutting half as much was compelling. How do you achieve tight construction? Someone asked. Consistent notches, every notch the same depth, same angle, same fit. When the notches match, the logs seat without gaps. Without gaps, heat doesn't escape. Without heat escape, you burn less wood. He picked up the angle block. This ensures consistency. It's a jig. You clamp it to the log. It guides your saw and chisel. Every cut matches the jig. Every notch matches every other notch. He demonstrated. Clamp the block to the demonstration log. Cut a dovetail notch in 12 minutes. The cut was clean, precise, identical to the notches on the other end of the log that had been cut with the same jig months earlier. Then he removed the block and demonstrated traditional scribing, laid one log across another, scribed the curve, cut by eye, checked the fit. The process took 18 minutes and required 2 rounds of trimming to get the fit acceptable. The results weren't even close. The jig cut notch was superior in every measurable way: speed, precision, consistency. How long to make the blocks? A builder asked. 3 days for a complete set: dovetail block, saddle notch block, and a half-lap block if you're doing complex corners. What's the cost? Materials, maybe $2 if you buy new lumber, less if you use scrap. Your time is the main investment. And the fuel savings? Depends on your baseline. If you're building fast and loose, you might save 50%. If you're already building tight, maybe 25%. Either way, the payback is 1 winter. The crowd absorbed this. 3 days of work in exchange for having your winter fuel needs. The calculation was obvious. One of the Army carpenters, a sergeant named Davies, stepped forward. The fort's expanding next year. We're building 6 new structures. If we used these jigs, would we see similar savings in heating costs? Yes, the principal scales. Residential, storage, barracks, doesn't matter. Tight walls save fuel. Davies nodded. I want a set, and I want to learn how to make more. That broke the hesitation. Within an hour, 12 people had committed to building their own angle blocks. The Homesteader spent the afternoon sketching dimensions, explaining joinery, answering technical questions. Thomas Mills watched the proceedings with satisfaction. He'd been right. The method had value, not just for individual settlers, but for anyone who built with logs on the frontier. The fort would adopt it. Merchants would stock the materials. Builders would add it to their standard practice. But the real spread wouldn't come from commercial adoption. It would come from neighbor teaching neighbor. From one settler showing another how to survive winter without burning through their labor and fuel consumption. From the quiet calculation that you could save 72 hours of work in killing cold by spending 3 days building a jig in September. The demonstration ended at dusk. People departed with sketches, measurements, and plans. The Homesteader packed his angle blocks and headed back to Wind River Valley. He'd given away knowledge that could have made him wealthy. He'd charged nothing. His reasoning was simple. The frontier killed enough people through bad luck and harsh conditions. No point in letting it kill people through bad construction when better methods existed and could be shared. Spring arrived on March 29th. Temperature rose above freezing and stayed there. Snow began its long melt. Creeks swelled with runoff. The valley transformed from white to brown to green over the course of 6 weeks. Settlers emerged to assess winter's damage. Cabins showed varied results. Some had weathered well. Others showed serious structural stress. Sagging roofs from snow load, corner joints that had separated, walls that had shifted on unstable foundations. The homesteader's cabin showed minimal damage. One section of chinking had cracked and needed replacement. The door required rehanging after winter expansion, and contraction shifted the frame slightly. The roof needed a few repairs where wind had torn away sections of sod. Total repair time, 1 day of work. Hayes's cabin, the one that had been partially rebuilt in February, showed moderate damage. The rebuilt corners had held firm. The original corners that hadn't been reworked showed separation and would require attention before next winter. But the structure remained sound. Hayes had survived, and his family was intact. Of the 16 families that had stayed through winter, 14 remained on their claims. 2 departed in April, not from structural failure, but from depleted supplies and exhaustion. They'd survived, but the cost had been too high to justify another year. The 7 families who'd abandoned their claims in January did not return. Their cabins stood empty, deteriorating. By law, abandoned homesteads reverted to public domain after prolonged absence. These structures would be scavenged for materials or claimed by new settlers. The labor invested in their construction was lost. The homesteader walked the valley in early May, examining the abandoned cabins. All showed similar failures: loose notches, excessive chinking, poor corner joints. None were beyond repair, but repair required knowledge that their builders hadn't possessed. He counted the gaps in one cabin's walls. 43 distinct cracks where light showed through. Each crack represented heat loss. Altogether, they represented the difference between 4 cords per month and 6, the difference between staying and leaving. On May 7th, the first new settlers arrived in the valley. 2 families, both headed for unclaimed land to the north. They stopped to ask about conditions, about what winter had been like, about who had survived and who had left. The homesteader told them about the angle blocks. One of the new arrivals was a builder from Pennsylvania. He understood joinery. He examined the blocks with immediate recognition of their value. "These are templates," he said. "We used similar jigs back east for furniture work. Never thought to apply the principle to log construction." It works the same way. Consistency matters. When every joint matches, performance is predictable. The builder borrowed the blocks for 2 days. He built his own set, modified slightly for the tools he carried. When he returned the originals, he brought a bottle of whiskey as payment. "Can't accept it," the homesteader said. "Method's free. You paid with your time and materials to build your own set. That's sufficient." The builder insisted. They compromised. The homesteader accepted the whiskey, but required the builder to demonstrate the blocks to the next settler who asked. This became the pattern. Knowledge spread through demonstration and requirement. Every person who learned the method agreed to teach the next person. No money changed hands. No formal instruction occurred. Just one builder showing another how to cut a notch that would hold through winter. By June, 7 homesteads in the valley were using variations of angle blocks. By August, when building season peaked, 11 were using them. Not every settler adopted the method. Some still preferred speed over precision. Some lacked the carpentry skills to build the jigs. Some simply didn't believe the fuel savings justified the extra construction time. But those who adopted the method saw results. Fuel consumption dropped. Repair requirements decreased. Cabins stayed warmer with less effort. The homesteader kept records. He tracked which cabins used the blocks and which didn't. He noted fuel consumption patterns where settlers reported them. By fall, the data was clear. Angle block construction reduced winter fuel needs by an average of 43% compared to standard builds. 43% meant the difference between cutting 18 cords of wood or 32 cords. The difference between 70 hours of winter woodcutting or 123 hours. The difference between approaching spring tired but intact or exhausted and broken. The method wasn't perfect. It didn't eliminate all construction challenges. It didn't guarantee survival, Bad luck, poor planning, or inadequate supplies could still kill you. But it removed one variable from the survival equation. It made walls predictable, and in an environment where unpredictability killed, even small improvements in reliability mattered. Spring turned to summer, summer turned to fall. The cycle continued, and in cabins across the valley, logs fitted with precision held firm, ready for the next winter's test. The winter of 1858 proved milder than the previous year. Temperatures dropped below zero only 8 times. Snow accumulation was moderate. Storms were intense but brief. Settlers who'd barely survived 1856 found 1858 almost pleasant by comparison. But mild winters reveal different lessons than harsh ones. The homesteader continued tracking fuel consumption. His cabin burned 1 1/4 cords in December, 1 1/2 cords in January, 1 cord in February. Total, 3 3/4 cords for the heart of winter. Extrapolated across November through March, total consumption would be approximately 6 to 7 cords. His nearest neighbor, a new settler who'd arrived in spring and built using traditional methods, burned 2 1/2 cords in December, 3 cords in January, 2 cords in February. Total, 7 1/2 cords. Extrapolated across the full winter, 12 to 14 cords. The fuel consumption ratio held steady around 50%, even in mild conditions. This was significant. Harsh winters exaggerated differences in cabin performance, but the underlying efficiency remained consistent across all conditions. A cabin with tight notches used half the fuel of a cabin with loose notches, whether the winter was brutal or moderate. The economic implications were substantial. Firewood had labor cost and opportunity cost. Every hour spent cutting wood was an hour not spent on other productive work. In a mild winter, this mattered less. You could cut wood during decent weather without much hardship. In harsh winters, it mattered immensely. Cutting wood in lethal cold was dangerous and exhausting. But the long-term calculation favored efficiency, regardless of any single winter's severity. Over 5 years, the time required to prove up a homestead claim, a settler building with angle blocks would cut approximately 150 fewer cords of wood than a settler using standard methods. At 3 hours per cord, that was 450 hours saved. 450 hours was 56 working days, almost 2 months of labor saved by spending 3 days building jigs. The homesteader documented this calculation in his ledger. 5-year fuel savings, angle block construction versus standard, 150 cords, 450 hours, equivalent to 56 8-hour days. Investment, 24 hours to build jigs. Return ratio, 18.75 to 1. On January 15, 1858, a visitor arrived from Fort Laramie. It was Sergeant Davies, the Army carpenter, who'd attended the demonstration the previous March. He came with a request. The fort was expanding. 6 new buildings were planned, 4 barracks, 1 storage facility, 1 administrative structure. Davies had been assigned to lead construction. He wanted to use angle blocks for all 6 builds. He'd already built the jigs based on the demonstration. Now he wanted verification that the method worked at scale. How many notches in 6 buildings? The homesteader asked. Approximately 340, total, maybe more depending on final designs. And you've built the jigs? Yes, dovetail and saddle notch blocks. We fabricated them in the fort's carpentry shop over December. Better materials than you used, kiln-dried oak for the frames, iron hardware for the adjustments. But same principle. Did you test them? Built a small equipment shed in November, 16 notches. They worked perfectly. Every joint seated flush. No shimming, no gaps. The homesteader nodded. Then you don't need verification. You've already proven the method scales. Davies smiled slightly. The fort commander wants external confirmation before we commit to using them on major structures. Says we need expert assessment. I'm not an expert. I'm a homesteader who built a jig to save firewood. "That's expert enough. Will you come to the fort and inspect the work?" The homesteader agreed. He traveled to Fort Laramie in late January, examined the test shed Davies had built, and reviewed the plans for the 6 new buildings. The construction quality was excellent. The angle blocks worked as well with professional Army carpenters as they had with a single settler in a valley cabin. He provided written confirmation. Examined construction at Fort Laramie, January 28, 1858. Joinery quality superior. Method appropriate for planned expansion. Expected fuel savings, 50% versus standard construction. Recommend adoption. The fort adopted the method. Construction began in March and concluded in October. The 6 buildings used angle block joinery throughout. When winter arrived, the fuel consumption data confirmed predictions. The barracks used 46% less heating fuel than older structures of comparable size. The Army took notice. By 1860, forts across Wyoming and Montana territories were using similar jigs for new construction. The method had scaled from 1 cabin to institutional adoption in 4 years. But the spread wasn't driven by institutional authority. It was driven by numbers. Lower fuel costs meant lower operating expenses. Lower operating expenses meant resources available for other needs. The calculation was pragmatic, not ideological. The homesteader returned to Wind River Valley in February. He noted in his ledger, "Method validated at institutional scale. Adoption proceeding via demonstrated economic advantage. No promotion required. Efficiency markets itself." By spring of 1859, 23 cabins in the Wind River Valley region were using angle blocks for construction or reconstruction. The method had spread beyond its point of origin, carried by settlers moving to adjacent valleys and by word traveling through informal networks. The homesteader received a visit in April from a man he'd never met. The visitor's name was John Peterson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd filed a claim 40 miles east. Peterson had heard about the angle blocks third hand, from a merchant in a supply depot who'd heard it from a freighter who'd heard it from a settler in Wind River Valley. Peterson brought his own angle blocks, built based on descriptions and rough sketches. The blocks were different from the homesteader's original design. Peterson had modified them to work with pine logs, shorter in length than cottonwood, harder wood requiring different cutting techniques. The modifications were intelligent adaptations. "Did the modifications work?" the homesteader asked. "Yes. Fuel consumption is 40% below my neighbor's cabin. He built standard method, I built with the blocks. Same winter, same wood, different results." "Then you've improved the design. For pine, your version is probably better than mine." Peterson seemed surprised. "You're not concerned that I changed it?" "Why would I be? The goal is tight notches. If your modifications achieve that for different wood species, that's progress." This conversation represented something the homesteader had understood from the beginning. Useful innovations evolve through adaptation. A method that works for one set of conditions gets modified to work for others. Rigid adherence to original design limits spread. Flexible principles enable adoption across varied contexts. Peterson left with measurements of the homesteader's original blocks and sketches of his own modifications. He promised to share both versions with other Norwegian settlers in his region. The method would continue spreading, changing as needed to fit local materials and skills. In May, the homesteader received a letter from Thomas Mills, the contractor who'd arranged the Fort Laramie demonstration. Mills reported that the angle block method had reached settlements in Montana Territory. A group of miners building winter quarters had adopted it after one of their crew had worked on the Fort Laramie expansion. The mining camps were using angle blocks for bunkhouses and supply sheds. Mills also reported commercial interest. 2 lumber suppliers in Cheyenne wanted to manufacture and sell pre-made angle blocks. They'd offered Mills a commission if he could identify the original inventor and negotiate manufacturing rights. The homesteader's reply was brief. Method is public knowledge. No rights claimed. Anyone may manufacture and sell angle blocks without permission or payment. Recommend pricing fairly so settlers can afford them. He had no interest in profit from the technique. His goal had been survival, not commerce. The method had achieved that goal and was now helping others achieve the same. That was sufficient return. By summer, the first commercially manufactured angle blocks appeared in supply catalogs. They were more refined than home-built versions, machined rather than hand-cut, with brass adjustment screws instead of wooden wedges. They cost $3 per set, which was steep but within reach for settlers who wanted to avoid building their own. Sales were modest. Most settlers still built their own jigs from scrap lumber. But the commercial availability meant that even settlers without carpentry skills could access the method. This removed one barrier to adoption. The homesteader tracked the spread through letters and reports from travelers passing through the valley. By his estimate, somewhere between 200 and 300 cabins across Wyoming, Montana, and western Nebraska were now using angle block joinery. Impossible to confirm precisely, but the scale was clear. What had started as one man's solution to his own cabin's fuel consumption had become a regional building practice. The fuel savings at scale were significant. If 300 cabins each saved 15 cords per winter, that was 4,500 cords not cut. At 3 hours per cord, that was 13,500 hours of labor saved across the region. 13,500 hours was 1,687 8-hour days. In a region where labor was scarce and survival margins thin, that represented meaningful resource preservation. But the homesteader understood something more fundamental than labor savings. The angle blocks had changed how settlers thought about construction. Before, cabin building was about speed. Throw up walls fast, start farming, worry about refinements later. After, at least some settlers were building with precision from the start. They were investing time in jigs because they understood that quality joinery paid dividends throughout the structure's life. This shift in mindset mattered more than any specific tool. Tools could be lost or broken. Mindsets persisted. Once a builder understood that consistent notches meant predictable performance, that principle applied to every future build, regardless of whether they used angle blocks, another jig system, or simply careful handwork. The method had seeded a broader idea, that frontier construction could be both fast and precise, that you didn't have to choose between speed and quality. You just had to invest time in the right places. 3 days building jigs, 42 days building the cabin, 5 winters of reduced fuel consumption. The math closed decisively in favor of precision. The homesteader was 34 years old in the fall of 1859. He'd filed his claim in 1856. He had 1 more year to complete the 5-year residency requirement and gain full ownership of his 160 acres. His cabin had performed flawlessly through 3 winters. Total fuel consumption for those 3 years, 19 cords. A standard cabin would have used approximately 40 to 45 cords over the same period. He'd saved 26 cords of cutting, which translated to 78 hours of work. 78 hours was 9 3/4 8-hour days. Almost 2 weeks of labor, saved by 3 days of jig construction in 1856. But the real value wasn't the labor saved, it was the time gained. Time spent on other improvements to the homestead, time spent healthier and less exhausted, time that compounded into a more successful claim. He'd added a barn in 1857, built using the same angle block method. The barn's walls were tight, keeping livestock warmer in winter. Warmer livestock meant better survival rates and better spring condition. The barn had cost 43 days to build instead of the typical 35, but the extra 8 days of construction time had been repaid in improved animal health. He'd built a root cellar in 1858, dug into a hillside and lined with stone. The cellar maintained stable temperatures year-round. Food storage improved. Waste decreased. The cellar had taken 21 days to complete, a significant investment of time, but one that paid continuous returns. These improvements were possible because he wasn't spending 2 months of winter cutting wood. He was spending 1 month cutting wood, freeing up the other month for productive work. In September, a survey crew came through the valley. They were mapping routes for a potential freight road that would connect the valley to Fort Laramie and points east. The crew chief was interested in construction methods. The freight road would require way stations, and those stations would need buildings that could survive winter without excessive fuel costs. The homesteader showed the crew his angle blocks and explained the method. The crew chief took notes, sketched the jig design, and asked detailed questions about fuel performance. "The way stations will be unmanned most of the time," the crew chief explained. "We need structures that hold heat when occupied, but don't lose everything overnight when the fire goes out. Your method might work for that." It should. Tight construction means slow heat loss. A well-built cabin will stay above freezing overnight, even without a fire, as long as it's been warm during the day. The crew chief nodded. "That's what we need. I'll include this method in my report. Can't promise they'll adopt it, but I can make the case." The freight road was completed in 1861. The way stations used angle block joinery. Freighters reported that the stations held heat well, making overnight stops more bearable during winter runs. This was how the method continued to spread, not through promotion or marketing, but through practical demonstration leading to pragmatic adoption. Someone with a problem, in this case the freight company, needing heat-efficient way stations, encountered a solution that worked, adopted it, and implemented it. The solution spread because it solved real problems efficiently. By fall of 1859, the homesteader had stopped actively teaching the method. He'd taught perhaps 20 people directly. Those 20 had taught others, who'd taught others. The diffusion pattern was exponential. He no longer needed to explain the angle blocks to every visitor. Information had reached self-sustaining velocity. He did, however, maintain a teaching template, a simplified angle block built with exaggerated features that made the principle obvious even to complete beginners. The template sat on a shelf in his cabin. Visitors could examine it, understand how it worked, and build their own versions without requiring lengthy explanation. This template represented the final stage of the innovation cycle, reduction to essential principle. The original angle blocks had been built to solve a specific problem for a specific cabin. The teaching template embodied the core concept stripped of context-specific details. Anyone could look at it and understand. Here's how you make every notch identical. On October 7, 1859, the first snow of the season fell. 3 inches, wet and heavy. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. The walls held heat. The homesteader sat at his table with his ledger, calculating firewood needs for the coming winter. Based on 3 years of data, he estimated he'd need 6 to 7 cords depending on severity. He had 11 cords cut and stacked. Ample reserve. Outside, in cabins throughout the valley, other settlers made similar calculations. Those who'd built with angle blocks found their numbers similar to his. Those who'd built standard construction faced tighter margins. Winter's sorting would begin soon. The walls would decide who stayed comfortable and who struggled. The notches cut in September would determine fuel consumption in January. The preparation done in warm weather would show its value in cold. The cycle continued. Method became practice. Practice became tradition. And the walls held firm. The method spread beyond Wyoming Territory by 1860. Settlers moving west carried knowledge of angle block construction to Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. Miners adapted it for high-altitude cabins. Ranchers used it for line shacks and winter quarters. The military built outposts using the technique. By 1862, the angle block method appeared in printed construction manuals. The first documented reference was in Practical Building on the Western Frontier, published in Chicago and distributed through supply houses serving Western settlements. The manual described the technique in technical terms. Jigs or templates for consistent notch cutting reduce construction time and improve thermal performance. Fuel savings of 40 to 50% compared to traditional scribing methods have been documented across multiple installations. The manual didn't credit the Homesteader. It didn't mention Wind River Valley. It presented the method as established practice, which by 1862 it was. This anonymity was consistent with most frontier innovations. Ideas spread through use, not through formal attribution. What mattered was effectiveness, not origin. Commercial manufacturers expanded their offerings. By 1863, 3 different companies were producing angle blocks. Designs varied. Some used adjustable iron hardware, some used wooden wedges, some incorporated level vials for vertical alignment. Prices ranged from $2.50 to $5 depending on features and materials. Sales records from one supplier, Morrison & Company, based in Denver, showed steady growth. 1861, 43 sets sold. 1862, 97 sets sold. 1863, 162 sets sold. These numbers represented only commercial sales, not home-built versions, which likely outnumbered purchased sets by 3 to 1 or more. The military's adoption accelerated spread. When the Army built forts using angle block joinery and those forts demonstrated superior heating efficiency, civilian contractors took notice. Government buildings set standards that influenced private construction. By 1864, angle block joinery was specified in government contracts for frontier structures. The fuel savings at scale became economically significant. A rough calculation based on available data estimated cabins using angle block joinery by 1865. 2,000 to 3,000 across Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, Idaho, and western Nebraska. Average fuel savings per cabin, 15 cords per year. Total regional savings, 30,000 to 45,000 cords per year. Labor savings at 3 hours per cord, 90,000 to 135,000 hours per year. Equivalent 8-hour days, 11,250 to 16,875 days per year. This represented approximately 30 to 50 person-years of labor saved annually across the region. Labor that could be redirected to productive work instead of survival consumption. The environmental impact, though not discussed in those terms at the time, was measurable. 30 to 45,000 fewer cords meant less pressure on cottonwood groves along creeks and rivers. In areas where timber was scarce, this mattered. Forests closer to settlements lasted longer. Settlers didn't have to travel as far to cut wood, but the method's spread wasn't uniform. Some regions adopted it quickly, others resisted. Resistance correlated with factors. Areas with mild winters saw less need for fuel efficiency. Regions with abundant timber saw less pressure to conserve wood settlements, with established builders using traditional methods change slowly. Remote areas lacking access to information or commercial jigs maintained old practices. The Homesteader, still in Wind River Valley, watched this diffusion through letters and reports from travelers. By 1864, he estimated that the method had reached saturation in Wyoming Territory. Most builders knew about it, and those who found it valuable had adopted it. Further spread would come from population expansion rather than knowledge diffusion. He proved up his homestead claim in 1861. The land was his. The cabin still stood solid, showing minimal wear after 5 winters. Total maintenance over those 5 years, rechinking twice, door rehang once, roof repairs twice. Approximately 3 days of work total. A standard cabin over the same period typically required rechinking annually, multiple roof repairs, corner joint stabilization, and various other fixes. Maintenance requirements were 2 to 3 times higher than the angle block cabin. This reduced maintenance meant lower lifetime cost. The initial investment, 3 days building jigs, 8 extra days of construction time, had been repaid many times over through reduced fuel consumption and reduced upkeep. By 1865, the angle block method was simply one technique among several that competent builders used. It had transitioned from innovation to standard practice. New settlers arriving in the region, Pondownthians, often learned it as part of basic construction instruction, not as a special method requiring separate teaching. The homesteader noted this transition in his ledger. Method now common practice, no longer remarkable. Integration complete. This was the final stage of successful innovation. Invisibility. When a technique becomes so widely adopted that it's no longer considered special, it has achieved full integration into standard practice. The angle blocks had reached that state by the mid-1860s. The walls they produced continued holding heat, saving fuel, and keeping settlers alive through mountain winters. Quietly, efficiently, unremarkably effective. 24 years after the homesteader built his first angle blocks, the tools still existed. They sat on a shelf in a barn, preserved but unused. The homesteader was 55 years old. He'd expanded his original claim through purchase of adjacent land. The cabin built in 1856 still stood, now used as a storage building. A larger house had been built in 1868. The valley had changed. The population had grown from 23 homesteads in 1856 to 78 occupied claims by 1880. A small settlement had formed around a general store and blacksmith shop. A road connected the valley to Fort Laramie and points east. The frontier had stabilized into community. Most cabins in the valley used tight joinery. Some had been built with angle blocks. Others had been built by skilled carpenters who achieved precision through experience and care. A few still showed loose construction from early settlement days, though these were being rebuilt or replaced as resources allowed. The fuel efficiency gap had narrowed. Average cabin fuel consumption in 1880 was approximately 3 cords per month during winter, down from 4 cords in 1856. This improvement came from multiple factors: better construction methods, superior chinking materials, double wall techniques learned from indigenous practices, improved fireplace design, and general accumulation of building knowledge. The angle blocks had been one part of this improvement, but not the only part. Their primary contribution had been demonstrating that precision mattered and could be achieved with simple tools. Once builders understood this principle, they found multiple ways to implement it. In May of 1880, a young carpenter from Pennsylvania visited the valley. He was 26 years old, recently arrived in Wyoming, looking for work and information about local building practices. Someone directed him to the homesteader. The carpenter introduced himself and explained his interest. "I've heard that a method for precision log joinery originated in this valley. I'm trying to document building techniques across the Western Territories. Would you be willing to discuss it?" The homesteader brought out the original angle blocks. The carpenter examined them carefully. "These are simple, elegant. How did you develop them?" "I needed my cabin to stay warm without burning through my winter's labor. Tight notches seemed like the logical solution. Jigs were the logical way to achieve tight notches." "And they worked?" "Yes. Fuel consumption dropped by half. Construction time increased by 20%, but the payback was 1 winter." The carpenter made notes. "This method has spread across multiple territories. Did you know that?" "I'd heard reports, never tracked it systematically." "It's in construction manuals now. Commercial manufacturers sell versions. The military specifies it for some contracts. By my estimate, thousands of structures have been built using this technique or variations of it." The homesteader nodded. "Good. It's a useful method." "You never sought compensation? Patent rights, licensing fees, anything? No, the goal was survival, not profit. If the method helped others survive, that was sufficient. The carpenter seemed puzzled by this. You could have become wealthy. This innovation has significant commercial value. Perhaps, but wealth wasn't the problem I was trying to solve. The problem was staying warm without exhausting myself cutting firewood. I solved that problem. The method spread because it solved the same problem for others. That's how useful ideas work. They spread through usefulness, not through commerce. The carpenter wrote this down, then asked, "What would you say to someone building a cabin today? Would you recommend angle blocks?" If they value precision and have the skills to build the jigs, yes. If they're experienced builders who can cut consistent notches by hand, probably not necessary. The tool enables precision, but precision is the goal. How you achieve it depends on your skills and available time. What about fuel efficiency? Is that still the primary benefit? Fuel efficiency comes from tight construction. Angle blocks help achieve tight construction, but double wall design, good chinking, proper fireplace location, all of these matter too. It's not one technique. It's an integrated approach to building structures that perform well in harsh conditions. The carpenter thanked him, examined the angle blocks one more time, and departed. The homesteader returned the blocks to their shelf. They'd served their purpose. They'd proven a principle. That principle had spread and evolved. The walls built with those blocks still stood. The cabin, 44 years old in 1880, remained structurally sound. It no longer served as primary residence, but it functioned perfectly well as storage. The logs hadn't rotted. The corners hadn't separated. The tight notches cut in 1856 still held firm. This durability was the ultimate validation, not fame, not wealth, not credit in construction manuals. Simply the fact that the structure performed its function year after year, decade after decade, requiring minimal maintenance and delivering consistent results. The walls had been built right. They'd stood through 24 winters. They would stand through many more. The original angle blocks remain in the valley to this day, or at least that's the local story. The homesteader's cabin stood until 1937, when it was finally dismantled. The logs showed minimal rot even after 81 years. Several pieces were preserved and are now displayed at the Regional Historical Society Museum in Lander, Wyoming. The angle block method itself faded from common use by the early 20th century as sawmills made dimensional lumber widely available and frame construction replaced log building across most of the frontier. But the principle that precision in joinery improves structural performance and reduces lifetime costs remained valid. Modern timber framing still relies on consistent joints and careful fitting. The tools have changed. The principle hasn't. In construction records from 1856 through 1880, the angle block method appears in approximately 2% of documented builds. This seems small until you calculate the absolute numbers. 2% of several 100,000 frontier structures means thousands of cabins built with the technique. Each one performed better than comparable structures built without precision joinery. Each one saved fuel, reduced labor, and kept its occupants alive through winters that killed less prepared settlers. No monuments mark the homesteader's innovation. No plaques commemorate the first angle blocks. The method spread without fanfare, solved problems without credit, and disappeared into history as frontier building practices evolved. But the evidence remains in survival rates, in fuel consumption records, in the documented spread of the technique across multiple territories. The numbers tell the story clearly. Tight joinery saved lives. Simple tools enabled tight joinery. One settler's solution to his own problem became a regional practice that helped thousands achieve the same goal. The lesson wasn't complicated. Build carefully in September. Stay warm in January. Invest time in precision. Reap dividends in efficiency. The equation closed favorably for those who understood it. The walls remember, even when history forgets.